My name is Denise Perrin and I have the pleasure of project managing Rural Links. We are funded by St Monica Trust and based in North East Somerset. The following talk is the third in a series recorded at our regular Wellness Wednesdays. These form part of a bigger picture of well-being and helping people living in rural areas have more information. Care provision is becoming a hot topic nationally and locally as budgets are being cut. In rural areas, the cost of care is much higher because of travel costs, and it's more difficult to find companies who are able to deliver. So for many, the prospect of care provision is a nightmare. George Person leads the Wills and Probate team of Thatcher and Hallam solicitors who are based in Midsummer Norton. He is passionate about ensuring people have more information so that they can plan ahead for their future. This talk is not a substitute for a one-to-one consultation which you can arrange with any local solicitor. I hope you enjoy listening to George myth-busting the legal and financial costs of care. First of all, I want to introduce you to George, who's come here from Thatcher and Hallam. Welcome, George. Thank you very much. And we've got village agents around the room. We've got Kate and Ian from the Carers Centre. They're here today. We'll try to keep the technical language to a minimum. Neither George nor I are experts in benefits, so I can't tell you if you should be on a benefit, but we can say it might be worth you talking to a village agent about something like attendance allowance, which is non-means tested. This is not a legal consultation. Would it work if it was? It wouldn't, would it? Every single person in this room has a completely different understanding and need. So, I'm going to hand over to George now. So you're going to have to project.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm George. I'm a solicitor at Thatcher and Hallam. For those of you who saw me 2 weeks ago, hello again. And I'm very pleased that you've decided to endure me for another hour. And for anybody new, then thank you very much also for coming along. And thank you to Denise for inviting me too. I've been a solicitor for coming up to, or been working in the law for about 15 years now. And I do wills, I do probate, which is administering people's estates when they pass away, tax planning, powers of attorney. But what I also deal with is inquiries regarding care. Quite a lot of the time I have a conversation regarding, well, you're going to do your will or you're going to do your power of attorney, but also I'm really worried about care and I'm really worried about how that's going to be funded. I'm really worried about what the rules are. I'm afraid also it's quite a political thing, care, as our Prime Minister did find out prior to the election, where certain changes were suggested in relation to how care operates in England and Wales and the UK more broadly, although it is different in Scotland. And I'm afraid it unravelled somewhat. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an outline about what care is currently in England and Wales. Give you a bit of an outline about some more practical issues, about sort of practical problems that I see and people face. And also I'm going to highlight a few concerns that I see about the way in which people think that care operates. Because when I was discussing this with Denise about what we called this talk today, I was very keen to call it myth-busting. Because there's a lot of myths out there. There's a lot of people who say to me, well, the local authority's going to take my house off me. Are they? Are they really going to do that? If local authorities were so keen on taking people's houses, maybe they'd have a big portfolio of houses and maybe they'd have a lot of money. So I don't think that's happening. So firstly, we used to have a system called the Care Charging for Residential Accommodation Guidelines. We don't have that now. We have the Care Act 2014. The Care Act 2014 is principally about dignity. It's about the dignity of an individual and it's about the dignity of the assessment that an individual has to go through. But also as part of that is an assessment because we live in a land of means testing. So if you need to have care provided for you in England and Wales, there is an assessment of your means and an assessment of your income and capital. Do you think local authority applies the rules the same way? No, absolutely not. No, you have different approaches taken by different local authorities because the care is administered by individual local authorities. Care is also funded, as far as those local authorities are concerned, by our council tax. It's funded by our council tax and also by direct grant from the UK government. Year on year, the direct grant tends to go down, and year on year, your council tax tends to go up. So the overall sort of real terms amount of money that's actually going into social care, I'm afraid, tends not to increase significantly. If you are means tested, is it the case that all of your assets are necessarily taken into account? If you have, say, a joint account with somebody, or if you, say, need your care at home, is it necessarily the case that your care is going to be provided or funded by you or funded by anybody else? A lot of the time, again, going back to this point about myth busting, I am faced with people saying, well, I've got to sell my house. Or, sometimes more worryingly, as far as I'm concerned, my family say I have to sell my house. Because there's this preconception, there's this idea that actually you have to do things in a particular way if you are in need of care. So what I would say to everybody, and again, this is, again, to echo what Denise was saying as well, this isn't to provide anybody with specific advice, and I'm disclaiming that. I'm not advising you all because I don't know your individual situations. But I would say very, very openly and earnestly that if you are, or a family member or a loved one is in need or is likely to be in need, find out about as much information as you possibly can about the situation, because sometimes these preconceptions and sometimes these myths are actually fairly toxic, because actually you have got options, and you might have options, more significant options than you think that you do initially. If you say need your care at home, do you think that your house would be counted as part of your means testing? Who would say that that would be the case? No, because you need your care at home. So it doesn't make any logical sense, but also the rules support it, that your house would not be taken into account as part of that assessment. So that's, again, a myth. There's also a myth about, okay, what I'll do, and I'll come back to this later on, is I'll give everything to my children. And then I've got no capital. Oh dear, because that is called a deliberate deprivation of assets. We talk about quite a lot about time limits for giving assets away. If you're talking about tax, you may be talking about something called a 7-year rule, and some people may have come across that. That's got absolutely nothing to do with care. That is a tax rule to do with gifting and whether your estate has got a tax liability for inheritance tax. Care, gifting assets, it can be done however many years previously. I had a client many, many years ago who sadly has passed away, and she gave away a property, and it was done 12 years before she died. And that was then assessed as being gifted deliberately 12 years previously. I know that the rules are complicated, and I also know that I haven't experienced these issues myself. I'm 40 years old, and I hope very much I won't be having to worry about care for myself for some considerable years. But what I would say is that the sooner that you start thinking about these things, and the sooner you start thinking about these things voluntarily, the better for you. So what I'm trying to do is trying to get people to look at what advice is available through local authority, what advice is available through charities. I've got absolutely the highest respect and regard for Age UK, because Age UK provide a significant amount of fact sheets, support sheets, and all sorts of other guidance and support, so that people can be forewarned and forearmed about what care options they have. So talking about care options, talking about practical care options, we all have the right to ask for a care assessment. Wherever age we are, we can ask the local authority to do an assessment of our care position. And I would say do that early. Do it early if you are thinking that you have any kind of care need. Do it early. Local authority have a right to charge for that, but they're not the only provider. So if they made a recommendation that a particular kind of care is necessary, then it isn't necessarily the local authority that has to cover that. But you can ask for that at whatever stage. A lot of the time, you're in a position where it may be quite a way down the line because perhaps there's been a fall, you've come out of hospital, and things are all coming at you at the same time. If you're able to perhaps project a little bit further back and say, actually, what I've got is I've got a little bit of perhaps infirmity, or I'm feeling like I am not as independent, you can get a dialogue going with the local authority about what kind of support you may require. I would also say as well, who do you think, if you are either presenting as having a care need, or if the local authority identifies that you have a care need, whose legal responsibility is it to sort out your care needs? Who do you think it might be? Nope, not family. Local authority, absolutely. As soon as you have either identified yourself or somebody else has identified you and you are on the local authority's radar, if you like, then it is their legal responsibility to find out what your concerns are and to provide whatever care package for you. So they're not doing it because they're being horrible, they're doing it because they're legally obliged. Now, whilst you have capacity, you can refuse whatever is suggested to you. You can say, I don't like that, I've still got my marbles and I'm doing what I want to do. And last time I looked, it is a free country, and you can do that if you want to do that, okay? If the local authority thinks you haven't got capacity, or has reason to believe you haven't got capacity, or can prove it, or has reason to believe that there's a possibility of abuse or neglect, then your view can be overridden, but only on those circumstances. And if you're able to say, actually, do you know what, I'm sorting myself out, I'm okay, there is no need for any intervention, then the local authority can go away. They can keep coming back and asking, but that is what they're obliged to do, and that's what would happen in every single case. So talking...
I was going to interject a myth that we encountered very early on with the village agents, and that is that there was a common belief that if you showed any signs of frailty, then someone was going to force you to go off and be taken into care. Now, this is we still encounter this. There's this fear that I daren't even let on that I'm struggling a bit or I'm needing a little bit of help because someone, I don't know quite who someone is going to send me to the doctors, and the doctor's going to sign me off, and I'm going to end up, and I'm going to have to lose my house. And then, you know what I mean? Like George was saying, it's if you haven't got the information, your mind goes to terrible, scary places.
Yep.
So what we're saying, as well, to pick up on what you've just been saying as well, is that actually it costs them more to do that. Bottom line, it's more costly to put you into a care home for the rest, yeah? There are so many possibilities, and George will go through those in a moment, that can lead up to when that might have to happen. And the carer centre are very involved in helping people through what all those possibilities are. So that's what, again, one of the myths that I want to bust today is that, as George says, you have the right of choice. Some of you come to me and say, I'm worried about so-and-so. And it might be a friend, a neighbour, and then you tell us that one of the problems is that they won't accept any help. And why do they not accept help? Because as far as they're concerned, it's a slippery slope that is going somewhere that they don't want, yeah? So what we're trying to say is this myth bust is allow yourself to be better informed and reassured so that you can go forward with dignity and be able to say, actually, I do need a bit of help. Okay? So anyone else coming up with a question before we go on to the next bit? Any questions? Are you all happy? They're all happy.
I think the next point is going to sort of follow on from what Denise was just saying about how people sometimes feel that they are if they do start asking for assistance, then a whole kind of cabal of people, so medical professionals, social workers, Uncle Tom Cobley and all, are going to come through the front door and really start upsetting their home life and home situation. We're all independent people, and we don't necessarily like people interfering with our the way in which we live our lives. It's the old Englishman's home is his castle. I totally agree with that, and why should you have anybody interfering with you or with the way in which you live your life, your finances, any of that, unless there is a pretty significant reason for it. I also have a little concern sometimes, and again with good reason, and I'm not any way disrespecting families, but sometimes families are a little bit misorganised or misinformed as well, and they say, oh well, mum's lost it completely. Has she? Has she really? Has mum got a clear idea about the way things are, or is mum perhaps just getting a little bit older and maybe just doesn't necessarily want to upset anybody? And sometimes a lot of that, sometimes not speaking up, is an incredibly difficult thing sometimes to do, but sometimes it's necessary to say, you know what, actually I don't want that, and actually what I want to do is I want to stay in my own home and I want to be looked after. Because looking at practical solutions about staying in your own home, everything should be done, in my view, and in the view I think of many studies, that the longer you stay in your own home, the longer you will be around. And local authorities are aware of that. They're absolutely aware of that. So the first principle is, okay, what can we do in that home? Did you know you can get up to £1,000 worth of adaptions for free to your home if you need them? Those kinds of adaptions, like little sloping ramps to go into a house, or handrails, or adaptions to the bath, things like that. That can be done. You could also apply, if needs be, to stay in your own home for what's called a disabled facilities grant, which is a grant based upon you need some kind of facility within your home to help you stay in your home, some kind of adaptation. So we'll be looking at those kinds of things, physical things that local authorities can do for you. Also, there are other little bits and pieces that you might think, actually, is it really care or is it just a little bit of assistance? Meals, washing. There are various organisations out there which either local authorities can put you in touch with or you can go to direct, that are care-based, that are really light touch. I mean, again, cooking, doing some washing up, doing some hoovering, all those kinds of things I make my children do for me. But all those kinds of things can be done, a very, very light touch. But that's all sometimes you need. Doing those kinds of little things, but maybe building up to, okay, maybe I need a more specific adaptation to my property, or I need something more significant to my property. So again, practically, if you are in a position where you are to be means tested, there's also a fairly significant discretion that is applied to any means assessment. So if you've gone to the position where we've exhausted any other kind of support and you need to have your care funded, you can have your care funded provided that your assets are less than a specific threshold. So if you have a couple, again, say if you had a joint account, it's only your share of that joint account, it's not the joint account entirely. And then people go, well, what about my house? Because capital is part of that assessment. Okay, who else is living in your house? Because if you say have a partner who is living in your house, then your house isn't taken into account. There's also specific thresholds on income. There's also thresholds on the type of income that you have. There's also thresholds to do with you're entitled to have a deductions on your capital thresholds for, say, if you needed to have a specific diet, you can write off the cost of your specific diet against the kind of capital thresholds. But again, as I say, going back to the disregarded property, if you have your partner living in the property is not taken into account. If, say, you had somebody who was not your partner living at home, say if you had an adult child living at home or a disabled child living at home, and again, property is not taken into account. If they are somebody under 60 and then acting in role of your carer, again, subject to agreement with the local authority, again, property not taken into account. And there's a lot of other little angles to this, which if you enter into a dialogue early with a local authority, you can find out about whether they're willing to operate any forms of discretion over how they assess you. So it isn't black and white. Like I said earlier on as well, you've got local authorities who are applying the rules differently depending on where you are. but you've also got local authorities not necessarily being completely bringing the shutter down and say, well, that's the decision, that's the way we're going to do it. Because you do have people who you can talk to. So, okay, you end up in a position where you perhaps do need to go into care. Here's another one for you. How many of us who are over the age of 65, what percentage of us of the UK population over 65 actually ends up in residential care? What percentage do you think? It's always good fun when I do this one. Percentage of
20%?
20%, 20% of 20%, 5%. So
5%.
only 5% of the adult population over the age of 65 actually ends up in residential care. And that's still, when you've got a population of 60 million people, it's still obviously a fairly significant amount, but it isn't necessarily going to be the case for everybody. If you do go into residential care, it's a buyer's market. You can have local authority care homes that have private places. You can have private care homes that have local authority places. You can have specific care homes that do certain things. You can have other care homes that do other things. I've been into several care homes in my career, and I go in sometimes into a care home and you have breeze blocks, and you go, this is a private care home and you're paying what for this? So it's very much a case of looking around and seeing what kind of care homes are out there, because there is, I'm afraid, sometimes not a lot of uniformity. But if you are in there, and if you're in that care home, you can dictate to a degree what kind of package you have, provided you've got the ability to do that, and provided you've got the dialogue going with social services or your social worker at the time.
I'm going to pause there because last time we were here, again, it's worth reminding you that we touched on, or in more detail, power of attorney. So if at any point you need a bit of help along the way, there is someone available that you've predetermined to help you what might feel an overwhelming, oh my God, I daren't say that they never get me up till 12 o'clock in the morning because they might not give me lunch. You know what I mean? So, and little things like that, and we've had situations where, not so much in care homes, but where people are receiving care packages, people to the door, and they're coming in and there for 5 minutes. And it's like, and it's so disruptive and horrible. Now, we know that it's not a perfect world, and we know there's another story attached to why that person was only there for 5 minutes. But actually, if a package has been put where they should be getting half an hour per visit, and this is happening too often, people have said to us, what you sort of unravel, and you think, what do you mean? They've literally, I call it feeding the budgie, that sort of put the seed in, pull the tray out the bottom, put a new tray in, and bop, bop, and you're out, feeding the budgie. Literally enough to say you've done the job, the budgie won't die, but is that care? Is that dignity in care? Okay? So, George, we were talking before we started. At what point, as you start reaching out, because that's what we're asking people to do, it's an old American phrase, reaching out, but it's actually quite useful, because at what point you start reaching out, what you don't want is for then someone to bite your hand off in we've got a mug here, I'm going to charge them £30 an hour for that, or a situation where a very good-hearted neighbour has been they've been doing the shopping, or they don't mind, changing the bed sheets and sticking them in, they don't mind that. And then 6 months down the line, they're also taking them to all of their appointments. And then they're doing this, and then they're doing that. And then that neighbour will come to us and saying, oh, I can't cope anymore, and I don't know how to tell this person. Because, of course, there's now that person is completely dependent. And if they understood the distress that was going on, they'd be mortified. So at that point, sometimes we suggest, well, actually, if it's reaching that level of need, as in, if you weren't there on any particular day, the things would start to fall to pieces, then you need to start looking outwards. Now, as soon as you're starting to look outwards, and you may therefore be needing to pay someone to be paying really for them to be to commit to being there What happens when I'm start handing money over to
Well,
someone?
I mean, this is something which I come across quite a lot, where you see, again, going back to the point about myth busting, where people think that the only option is to rely on the support of a neighbour or rely on the support of a friend. Every local authority, and again, I'm bigging them up here, are obliged to provide an advocacy service for everybody, because these rules to do with care and how you are supported can be complicated. Now, looking at individuals who may provide support on an informal basis, that is fine to a degree, but I'd be very concerned about where that leads, because I'm afraid being a solicitor for as long as I have to treat everybody as being evil and avaricious. And I'm afraid sometimes I'm proved right. And whilst it is very important to have connections, to have your connections locally and have that kind of support, it's also very important just to be aware what that connection is. Is it something where I'm just having a little bit of support for doing my shopping? Which again is fine, doing favours for people, but identifying early whether there's a line is being crossed and where suddenly you've got more support being provided, which becomes more of a, almost like a commercial relationship between somebody being a carer and somebody being cared for.
Or their form expectations from the person who's giving for nothing. I'm not getting paid, but I've been so good to that person.
Oh yeah. In law we have this principle called detrimental reliance. It sounds very simple and sounds very kind of quite basic, but if you've relied upon somebody or something to your detriment, then potentially you can create a contract. You can create something to come back in your direction. Okay, well, I've spent all that time doing that shopping for you. I've spent all that time helping you getting in and out of the bath, or I've helped you do whatever around the house. I could have been doing something else. I could have been doing something else for me. I could have been doing something else that perhaps there's a financial interaction for me. So I'm afraid sometimes you've got to be very aware very soon, very quickly, how whilst I'm not in any way, shape or form saying you shouldn't have friends and connections, because that's what life's all about. But equally, when we're talking about this kind of thing where it's something slightly different, where perhaps you're having that kind of support, what I would do is say, okay, voluntarily, contact local authorities, say, look, I might need some help and support. Can I get in touch with your advocacy group? Can they help me out? There's also a advocacy process if you have lost capacity, and in that scenario what's called a mental capacity advocate can be appointed for you if that's the situation that you're in. But I would be very mindful, very careful about when caring services that are being provided informally, when they might, without really realising it, take a slightly different turn.
So, okay, so the next step would be, thank you, neighbour, you've been fantastic. So let's pretend it's me. I've now thinking, well, actually, I do need someone to bring shopping in on a Friday. I do need that level of commitment from someone. So let's pretend that someone really suitable who's been recommended by another friend has said, look, Mary is so good. She's been so great with me. I would suggest that she comes and helps you out. So Mary comes and we sit and we have a chat and we agree that every Friday Mary's going to come in for 2 hours to support me.
The worry there is that, again...
I'm paying her. I would be paying her for 2 hours of work.
If you have any kind of arrangement like that where money is changing hands and services are being rendered and there's no contract, then oral contracts tend to be as good as the paper they're written on. So you've got a situation, what that means is you have to make it up if there is a problem. Okay, so I'm giving you money for something. What happens if suddenly you say, well, actually, I'm not bothered about doing this anymore? And is there any kind of like notice period? Well, no. Is there any kind of agreement about paying for anything that you need for doing that service, like the actual shopping? Is there any kind of agreement over, I will give you, I know, £50 a week and that will be direct debited into your account and then you'll use that, but you also have a security deposit. There's all those kinds of things, all those kind of little angles to that, which makes me very, very concerned, because the basis of that relationship is one that hasn't got really any rules. They're rules that you have made up based upon the conduct as between the parties. And that isn't very good if there's a dispute, because what have you got to go back to? Well, she said she'd always do that for me. Did she? Really? Was anybody around to witness that? Anybody around to kind of sign all that off? Anybody around to be aware about what happened and when the money was taken and et cetera, et cetera? I came across a situation a few years back where there was a very close relationship between two neighbours, one much younger than the other, and every week a cash card was given from the elderly individual to the younger individual. The cash card was given and it was taken to the cash point, and large sums of money were taken out of the cash point. After the event, a lot of these transactions were queried, and the defence was, well, that's what she told me. She said that I was allowed to do that. And it may be that these things start out relatively innocently, but actually you can see how these things can very quickly become abused and become a situation where you may find actually this is something a bit more criminal.
Lynn's got a question. So Lynn is asking that in that situation, would me, say let's pretend this is me in this situation, would I be classed as a vulnerable person because I've given over my cash card with good intent and this person is basically being nefarious? So am I now a vulnerable person because I've allowed that to happen? Is that your question?
This is a relationship born out of informality.
Yeah.
Who knows that this relationship exists? So local authority, anybody else from the outside looking in, nobody knows that this exists necessarily. So that's one point. Second point is that, again, if it's an informal relationship, like I say, you make up the rules yourself. So if you're making that kind of rule up, well, I never knew that she had problems with her capacity. I never knew about this situation. I never knew that there was anybody else looking after her. I just had this relationship where she gave me money. And she gave me money and I went and got her stuff.
So if you're getting money from the attendance allowance,
Yeah.
you can have anybody you want, can't you?
Your question, so that everyone can hear. So your question relates to if you're receiving benefit of some, whether it's attendance allowance or some income from the state, and you spend that money in that way to give to this person who's then, what's your question? Your question is, can something happen about that?
Well, I mean, that's absolutely right. If you're employing anybody to do any kind of caring for you, then absolutely you should be doing it through somebody who's a registered provider or who's got some kind of kite mark or certificate to say that they're able to do it. And there are plenty of care providers out there who, like I said earlier on, will do relatively light touch things. I think the concern we've got here is if you're receiving attendance allowance or you're receiving any kind of benefit and you're doing that informally with anybody, I think that is pretty much a recipe for disaster.
Yes, exactly. But there are services out there, and there is one in Bath that we use, that you can call them, or we call them on your behalf, and they will come and speak to you and say, okay, Mrs. Smith, what is it that you want? Shopping, da-da-da-da-da. Get all the spec, as it were. Get your list of what you would like to happen, how often, timescales, and all of that. And then they then are putting together a job description, which they then help you put out there as an advertisement. They've got a website, and people who do this sort of work will say, oh, right, there's someone in Magna, at least there's. Yes, it is a stranger coming in, but what I'm saying is when it gets to a level where you're relying on that person more than just informally, then it becomes a more of a need. As you say, it's partly because what I'm saying is these brokerage companies will be the person in the middle that will get them checked, make sure that there's a contract in place. At some point you are liable to pay a pension, aren't you, for that person, or contribution.
You've got to be very
pension.
careful when the informal becomes commercial.
Yes.
And I say this to clients a lot when you have even with family helping out, supporting. Now, we all hope that family will provide certain levels of support, and indeed some family do provide certain levels of support. But sometimes even there, it's important to make it clear what the expectations are, writing it down, saying if you're providing any form of support or money, you need to make sure there's some kind of regulatory framework, if you want to call it that, so that perhaps maybe if you have a son or a daughter who is providing levels of care and support, so that the other son and daughter who live in Sheffield or Australia don't turn around afterwards and say, well, hang about, where's all this money gone? And I mean, the sooner that you can get anything more formal And I would generally as well say steer clear from anybody who hasn't got those kind of kite marks and certificates, because if you're going to have any form of level of support, you want to be, in the very nicest way, you want to be able to have some kind of comeback if it goes wrong.
I completely understand what you mean, Lynn. Sometimes when people are reluctant to accept help, the best form of help, rather than none, is someone that they might know. Okay? That's better than no help at all. Yeah? What we've been talking about is when that escalates over time, there becomes a comfortable relationship, and also there's more of a dependency emerging. Now, it may be that that person, you knew them when they moved in next door as a 3-year-old child. You've known them all your life, all their life, right? So you feel you know them. So who needs a background check? I know their background, yeah. That is a familiar person. Great. Then there is temptation, and then there are boundaries that become blurred. Now, if you're in it, you won't necessarily see it. Sometimes we have conversations and we think, this is an interesting one. I suppose one of the things that I want to say, and it's not just because I'm a project manager for a fantastic service called the Village Agents, because we set this up back in 2010, and we've seen a lot of people. I suppose, from my point of view, is ask. It's okay to ask. Now, you're very fortunate that you've got a village agent in your area, because you can ask them the time of day, you can ask them how much it might cost to have my dog groomed. You can also ask them, is there anyone in the area that can come and cut my hedge? Is there someone that can help me fill out a form? Is there someone that will go with me to the hospital? Is there somebody that... I've heard this terrible story. My neighbour has had this happen, and I'm really scared, and and this is... who do I talk to? So we've got those people. You've got those in your neighbourhood now. You've got other people like the Carer Centre, and Ketten's here from Age UK. Sorry, we didn't give you a good earlier on because she's here in another capacity. But so there are lots of people to ask before you enter into any next step, yeah? Before you go next step, including, George, if you're wanting to get a bigger picture.
Talking all about today about all the support that's out there. There is fantastic support if you go and look. There's support online, support direct from the government, from local authorities, from Age UK, from Alzheimer's UK, all sorts of other support organisations out there. There are also, I'm afraid to say, a few snake oil salesmen. And I'm saying that with a little bit of concern, because there is or has been a bit of an industry in the last few years that has sort of taken off a little bit to do with care fees mitigation, where people will sell things, sell products to individuals to say, do you know what, I can sell you this and then you won't have to pay for your care, or I'm going to sell you this arrangement where you transfer your house. You've heard of things like equity release schemes. Well, not quite like equity release schemes, but there are other things called home reversion schemes, life interest trusts. There are different ways of schemes being set up which have been sold and sometimes are still sold on the basis that if you transfer your house or you transfer your money or you do this or you do that or you do the other, then you're not going to have to pay for care. Now, I would be very, very concerned if you had anything that comes through the door, because sometimes these things do come through the door and they say, are you worried about care? Are you worried about this? Are you worried about that? Now, I'm saying this completely openly. I'm a solicitor and I'm regulated. Okay, you can sue me for the advice I give. Okay, I'm insured. The advice I give might not necessarily be advice to my benefit, because I might tell you, you don't want to do that, and therefore there is no fee involved in it. But there are people out there who will sell schemes, and I'm just very mindful and very concerned about whatever schemes they are, because if anybody tells you that you can, in a sort of silver bullet touch, you don't have to pay for care if you do this, that, and the other, it's just wrong. Okay, and I would be very concerned about those kinds of arrangements. We talked about deliberate deprivation. You cannot give away assets with the intent to depriving yourselves of capital so that you then get care at the end of it. You're not allowed. It's simply end of story. But I also said earlier on about how it is a free country last time I looked. You are entitled to give away assets if you want to. You can still, this isn't to mean that you can't give away any assets because you think, oh, well, I can't give that money to my son or my daughter for their house deposit or because they need a bit of money. You're perfectly entitled to do that. The question is whether it's been done and whether it can be proved to be done with the intention of depriving you of that fund. If, for example, say you are, I don't know, 85 years old, you've only ever had a house, you only lived in that house your entire life, your affairs have been very straightforward, and then suddenly, at the age of 85, you just randomly transfer your house to your children. Local authorities aren't stupid. They might see that as perhaps, if there is any proximity to needing care, as being something done deliberately. And also, the rules say, if within 6 months of giving away an asset, within 6 months, it's instantly counted, if you go into care within that 6-month period, as part of your estate. So even if you've transferred it within that 6-month period, it's instantly counted back as part of your assets for means testing purposes. Also, they can seek recovery of any assets given to anybody from that individual. So if you give your assets to your child, they go, okay, you haven't got it, well, we'll go after them. Okay, and you can seek recovery from them and their assets. So you might inadvertently put children or grandchildren into a bit of a pickle. Also, as I say, you can go back however many years, 12 years, 10 years, 15 years, and if it can be proved that this has been done with any kind of deliberate intention, as I say, it can be put back. You don't have to be open, you don't have to be overt, but again, if it looks like it from the outside looking at it, then it may be just unpicked and deemed a deliberate deprivation. So if anybody suggests to you that they've got some kind of magic plan to rearranging their assets, believe you me, they don't. Okay?
Can I ask one question? How well versed are you with agriculture and the fact that a lot of farms are handed down through families?
So Julie's question is around agricultural inheritance of land.
It's not an unusual thing for farming families to go through generations. So looking at that, would that be considered deliberate if you transferred an asset? I mean, all of these things are not necessarily black and white. Because, again, if you were to say to local authority, actually, yes, there was a transfer, but that was always going to happen because it was promised on my son's 18th birthday, or it was promised when he was 30, or whatever, for whatever reason. Because you might, in particular with a farm, you might need to have succession because of the insurance on the land or because of the subsidies you're picking up on the land. There may be all sorts of other reasons why it's absolutely fair and logical to transfer it. But what I'm saying, it's not cut and dried. If there is a good enough reason to argue it out of the equation, then put the reason forward. But it isn't necessarily going to be the case it's going to be black and white.
One thing for certain is that you need more specialist advice. And again, for hundreds of years, generation has passed land and down the line. What's become a little bit more complicated is where there are subsidies, where there's sort of arrangements about stewardship and everything else. Now, of course, often the incoming generation are already being apprenticed on the farm, so they're sort of, you know what I mean? It's complex. And Jim, you've got another question. Tax reasons, yes.
There may be good reason for keeping farming land because of tax reasons. Because at the moment, if you have farmland for inheritance tax reasons, it's generally how it's presented is incredibly important.
Yes.
Because if you just look at it outwardly, like I said about the 85-year-old person who's just given away a house, outwardly the local authority might smell a rat. They might say, well, that's been done, and there's no other argument about it. But actually, if you sort of start kind of looking at that in a little bit more detail as to the reasons why that might have been done. We haven't talked at all about what's called a deferred payment arrangement. A deferred payment arrangement is where you might have significant assets like that. You might have farming assets that are tied up in a commercial enterprise like a farm. But there might be no real good reason for transferring it and selling it to cover your care costs. That might just be an impractical mess to try and sort out.
Right. I think we need a pause for thought. Now, last time, and this worked quite well. If you're going to be around
I'm
for a
happy
little
to have
while.
a cake.
First of all, I want, as it's Valentine's Day, I've got a special present for George for coming here.
Oh,
It's a tin of love hearts. And
I'm
it
blushing
says,
now.
"You're fab." You're fab.
thanks very much.
There you are.
That's very kind.
Got lots. That's my way of saying thank you. So first of all, give him a great big hand. For getting us this through that. Okay, just quick feedback. How useful was that? Yeah. Very. With another round of applause for Chris.
Thank you.
I think George deserves a cup of tea.